Hey everybody, let's talk Portuguese. Today I want to talk all about language apps and whether or not you can learn Portuguese with them, what they're useful for, and what you can get out of them when you're learning Portuguese. Before we get started, if you're enjoying my videos and you'd like to learn more, or if you'd like access to fun things like postcards directly from me, check out my Patreon where you can support my channel. The link for that is in the description of all of my videos. So when we're talking about learning languages by way of language apps, we're usually talking about things that are quick, easy ways to fill time on your phone when you're doing other things. The idea behind learning languages on apps is that it's kind of passive and kind of participative all at the same time in the way that we tend to use our phones for things like social media. This has some upsides and some downsides, as anything does. There are some main apps that you might be thinking of when you're thinking of language learning apps, things like Duolingo or Rosetta Stone. Each of these apps has different strengths and weaknesses based on their approach to language learning. That being said, the approach used by most of these apps is roughly similar. Fundamentally, the main way that these apps are trying to help you learn a language is by trying to teach you in the manner of a child. The way that children learn language is through natural exposure to it. This is, of course, on the contrary of learning languages via grammar or books or other things of that nature. When we talk about some of the language apps, a lot of the times they are attached to services that offer things that are like language classes. Some of them, like Duolingo, are contained in their own app, and the app itself is trying to emulate the classroom. Other types of apps are really just meant to be a supplement to the other language learning that you're already doing. Usually these are in the form of flashcard decks that you can download, or apps like Anki. Sometimes these apps can have full systems behind them. When we think about Rosetta Stone or Pimsleur, you're thinking about books and audio courses and interactive things that you can do with software that they've been doing since computers have been able to support that kind of learning. These apps tend to cost more money on the promise that you're getting a more complete education in the language that you're trying to learn. Free options like Duolingo try to emulate this experience but don't charge the user anything in order to do so. But let's talk a little bit about Portuguese specifically and what you can do with Portuguese and an app. When it comes to major languages that have large regional dialectal differences like Portuguese or Spanish or even English, you will always run into the problem of whether you're getting the variety that you're trying to learn included in your app experience. This can be more or less pronounced. For example, in English, it's usually pretty clear-cut whether you're getting American or British English, and they are generally not mixed. In Spanish, what a lot of apps will try to do is combine little elements of all of the different regional varieties and create a sort of hybrid generic Spanish that doesn't necessarily exist in the real world, but will help you get understood when you're trying to use it anyway. In the case of Portuguese, however, we have a problem, which is the fact that in Portuguese we have two major dialects that are fully codified and widespread in the world. Those are Brazilian Portuguese with over 200 million speakers and European Portuguese with somewhere around 10 to 15 million speakers. The discrepancy between the two becomes very obvious right away. The overwhelming majority of resources on the internet, whether it's an app or otherwise, are available for Brazilian Portuguese exclusively. A lot of the time when you're looking to study Portuguese, European Portuguese is not included in any capacity, with the idea that if you learn Brazilian Portuguese, you'll be able to make yourself understood and that you will have some level of understanding of European Portuguese to go along with it. I question the extent of truth that exists within this, as I find that a lot of learners who have studied Brazilian Portuguese and only come to a moderate understanding of the language have the most difficulty in adapting to European Portuguese pronunciation and other patterns of speech. The other simple fact of the matter is that the differences between European and Brazilian Portuguese are too great to jumble it into a sort of general Portuguese. That doesn't exist, it cannot exist, and there are a lot of reasons why that include differences in the codification of the normative standard between both countries, as well as fundamental differences in the way that each variety is pronounced in a general fashion. For as much as you could mix and match your vocabulary between the two, those differences are still too great of a hurdle to overcome to create a sort of generic form of Portuguese. So the first main hurdle that we have when we're talking about language apps and Portuguese is that the dialectal availability is not that great. If you're a student of European Portuguese, you will find it significantly harder to find modern, thorough, and complete resources regarding European Portuguese. And with European Portuguese sources, you also run the risk of having sources that are done by Brazilian or other foreign speakers of Brazilian Portuguese that are actually just getting things wrong. So if you're learning European Portuguese, you have a much steeper hill to climb. That being said, the resources available for Brazilian Portuguese are fairly widespread, they are very thorough, and they are very complete. If you're looking to learn Brazilian Portuguese, you will have a much easier time, whether it's on an app or some other resource on the internet. But regardless of which variety that you're trying to learn, we also need to talk a little bit about the scope of language apps. As a general rule of thumb, whether we're talking about Duolingo or Rosetta Stone or any of the other multitude of apps that are available on the internet, the depths to which you can increase your knowledge are fairly limited. Apps are a great tool for getting a basic understanding of how a language works, as well as a basic vocabulary in any given language. For languages that are more commonly studied as a second language, such as, for example, English, you may be able to get more out of a language app, but the point stands that with a language like Portuguese, you're really only going to get the basics if you're only studying on an app. A general rule of thumb when you're doing something like Duolingo and going through all of the course tree is that you're going to end that course with an A1 or a B2 level at the most if all you're doing is studying in that app. What this means is that if you're looking to get fluent in Portuguese and you already speak a little bit of it, or you already have a basic understanding of how it works, language apps aren't going to push you into that B2 or C1 territory. They are certainly not going to push you into C2 level, which can only come from time and experience and immersion in a language. However, if you're looking to get a basic understanding of Portuguese, or you'd like to have a more complete basic vocabulary in Portuguese, apps are a good way to get started. One of the positive aspects of apps is that they encourage you to do something with the language every day. And not only are they encouraging you to do something with them, they are interactive and they're having you use your brain in order to use the language and make those connections with your brain. When we're learning languages, it is of course the most important that we are actually using them. It's not enough to pick up a book for half an hour a week and expect that you're going to learn a language in a couple of months. It simply does not work that way. If the whole point of learning a language is to learn how to communicate with people, we need to be using the language in a way that helps us communicate with people in order to establish the connections in our brain that will let us use that language further and further. Think of it this way. What good is learning a language if you're not going to talk in it or use it in some way to understand things or be understood by people who speak that language? In my opinion, there is no use. Even people who study dead languages like ancient Greek or classical Latin are using those languages in some manner or another in order to understand other linguistic functions, historical texts, and so on. With all of that being said, for this reason, apps like Duolingo, Memrise, or Rosetta Stone and other apps that are similar to those are generally speaking a fairly good place to kick off your language learning. If you're just trying to get the basics down and you'd really like to have a solid, concrete base from which to work to continue your studies later on, I would recommend pretty much any of those apps to get a taste for what you're doing in Portuguese. The caveat, of course, is always if you're trying to learn European Portuguese, you are going to have a much harder time. Duolingo, which is of course the most popular language learning app, only teaches Brazilian Portuguese. The last thing that I have to say with regard to studying one variety of Portuguese or another is that it is most advisable that you continually study the same variety of Portuguese because it is most advisable not to mix them up if you can so help it. Yes, you certainly could start to learn Brazilian Portuguese and get a basic feel for how Brazilian Portuguese works, and then go on to learn European Portuguese in Portugal or something of that nature. But because of the big differences between how Brazilians and Europeans European speakers of Portuguese conceive of things like grammar and even just the phonetic aspects of each variety, this will make your language learning harder than is necessary. So although it is more difficult to find resources for European Portuguese from the ground up, if you're able to do so, I would recommend that over starting with Brazilian Portuguese and then moving to European Portuguese later on. If you're just trying to learn Brazilian Portuguese, you can just use anything. The last type of app that I want to talk about in terms of language learning and learning Portuguese are things like flashcard apps. Flashcards and learning vocabulary by memorization are just inherently not the most efficient way of learning a language to begin with, because the way that we learn language is by using it. We associate words with ideas that we then understand and are able to use in a contextual manner. That is the basic function of words and also how human language works. So if you are just trying to rote memorize a word with a flashcard, not only are you not placing it into context in the language, you are also constantly using a translation of that word in your head from your native language to the target language, and you're not really developing the idea association with that word in the new language. That being said, there are a lot of flashcard apps. You've probably heard of things like Anki or other apps that are available on any of the app stores. Those are all fine and well, but the variety differences between the languages are also something that you have to look out for when we're talking about flashcard decks. If you happen to be using flashcards or flashcard apps for Portuguese, you have to make absolutely sure that you are getting either Brazilian or European Portuguese because of the lexical differences between the two. And with European Portuguese, as I mentioned earlier, you have to make sure that you are actually getting European Portuguese that has been developed by European Portuguese speakers and not people who speak Brazilian Portuguese and are trying to just expand the reach of their app. The reason for this latter case is basically just quality control. Given the scarcity of European Portuguese resources, when people who speak Brazilian Portuguese are trying to accommodate European Portuguese, there can be cases where there are gaps in the European lexicon or where there are words that Brazilian speakers are simply unaware of in Portugal. Now, I am also not saying that this mix-up of Brazilian and European Portuguese is extremely rampant when it comes to European Portuguese learning online. However, it is always something that you need to make sure that you're being aware of when you're looking into resources that aren't coming directly from Portugal. Now, having gone through the pros and cons of language learning apps, my overall review of them is that if you're a beginner or you're looking to solidify your beginner level base of Portuguese, the apps are not a bad way to start. This is especially true if you're learning Brazilian Portuguese, and it's a little bit more complicated if you're learning European Portuguese. Overall, if you're looking to get fluent in Portuguese, the only way that you can really accomplish that is by learning proactively. You need to take courses in which you are learning Portuguese grammar, and you need to be doing things with the Portuguese language. That means you need to be talking to people, you need to be reading, listening, and watching Portuguese in order for your brain to be able to make all of those connections that are necessary to develop a fluent level of understanding and comprehension, as well as the ability to actually speak. Quite simply, the more exposure to Portuguese that you have, the more that you're going to be able to develop your input, which is your understanding, as well as your output, which is your speech or your writing. So, as always, my recommendation is, of course, a course. If you can go to a Portuguese-speaking country to learn the language, that is even better because then you will be around the language constantly, always. If you can't afford that or that's not in the cards for you, go to your local college and look for a Portuguese language class and ask about which varieties they teach and what you're going to be learning in the classes. It's better than nothing, and a course is going to give you a more well-rounded base of knowledge and will progress through the language in a systematic way that will be much more conducive to learning than just an app. Apps are a great way to learn Portuguese in an incremental way, and they're a great supplement to keep you using the language. But if the main focus is just continuing to use the language, you need to find things that you're interested in Portuguese and interact with them a lot. Read things online, read the news in Portuguese, watch videos or watch shows or movies in Portuguese. Basically, if you're not using Portuguese and you don't have an interest in things that are in Portuguese, your Portuguese is not going to go anywhere. But if you're using Portuguese a lot and you're engaging with it a lot and you're using the apps as a supplemental source of learning, you will go further than you would if you were not using them. So that's all I've got for today's video about learning Portuguese with apps and what I think of language learning apps in general. I hope you found this useful or informative. If you did, if you learned something or otherwise found it interesting, give me a thumbs up down below. You might think about subscribing to my channel if you're not already. And if you'd like to learn a little bit more or dive deeper into the videos that I post, check out my Patreon down below and consider joining my Patreon. I post extras there, including reading lists for the videos that I make, and you can even get access to fun things like postcards. I have a lot more videos about Portuguese on my channel, which you can find in the eye above, and I will see you next time.